What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about why Vesper's Host is the hardest dungeon in the game to solo flawless. And you may be thinking, no shit Tizzle, the boss fight is crazy. Or duh, it's the latest dungeon and they all just get harder to solo flawless with each entry. But I don't actually think that's true. For me personally, I still think Duality is one of the toughest dungeons to solo flawless for reasons that I will reference in this video. And a lot of that comes down to encounter design. So firstly, everyone has to start somewhere, and what may be easy and routine to one person is a great accomplishment to another person. I struggled like hell to solo flawless Pit of Heresy, which was my first solo flawless, and now I can do that in 20 minutes while watching YouTube on my side monitor. That isn't to brag either, it's to express that with experience you get better and better at doing things. I have 233 Pit of Heresy clears, more than double my next closest dungeon, which is Prophecy at 111. So I can run that dungeon on autopilot mode now. But the thing with that dungeon design is it is very formulaic, and also we have gotten so much stronger in the nearly 5 years since I soloed it for the first time. But the point is the formulaic design, and that is a big reason that Vesper's Host is so tough, because the final boss requires so much reaction. It is unlike any other dungeon boss or really any Destiny boss fight that we've seen. I did a whole video yesterday breaking down why Vesper's Host dungeon boss fights are so unique, so you should check that video out after this one for a more in-depth breakdown. But for this video, I more want to focus on what makes this dungeon so difficult to solo flawless, and that is the dungeon challenges you in ways we've never really seen before. Or maybe that we've seen them before, but this dungeon just combines all those challenging things into one. So since we were just on the topic of the final boss, let's start there. This is by far the hardest boss fight to get through. The floor is lit up with lightning half the time, and if you step in it, you'll take damage. This also keeps you from being able to regen your health. At least until you dunk the core halfway through damage, there is really no safe place to stand whatsoever. You get peppered from all angles by the puppets on the 3 platforms, and then if you do try and take cover, the boss will call down a lightning strike at your location, forcing you to move. In basically every other dungeon fight, if you get low on health, you can retreat somewhere to recover. Your DPS will most likely suffer, but you can at least play your life. In this fight, however, that really isn't the case. Prophecy final boss in the lead up to damage was pretty unforgiving. When all 3 echoes were in the corners, you had to get one down to have any sense of cover, and the knights could also go Super Saiyan and push you. It was a very tough fight back in the day, but with things like restoration or easy access to devour or invis or damage resistance like we have now, it's definitely much easier. But that used to be a really hard part of soloing Prophecy, so much so that people would usually save their super for the first part of that room. Cube room was also tough because you had to react to the room changing and enemies spawned in all over, and then you'd also have to leave cover to dunk the moats on the right platform while the hobgoblins were sniping you. So this design of giving you no safe space isn't super common, but when it is done, you have to rely on movement and smart build crafting to get around it. Duality is a tough dungeon to solo, but if you are hurt from the Scion snipers during damage, there are some safe spots you can go to. Most dungeons have this, but Vesper's Host boss fight does not. The next is unforgiving or punishing timers. Most dungeons have this in some form or another. Shattered Throne Ogre boss, you have to get those petitioner's marks before time runs out. This was tough back in the day when the wizards were hard to kill, but now it's a non-issue. Pit of Heresy in the Chamber of Suffering requires you to be on the totem, and if you stray too long, you wipe. These are just a couple of examples, but it illustrates the point of an unforgiving timer. Spire the Watcher doesn't really have these at all, and that is one reason it's such an easy solo flawless. I solo flawless at day 1 without practicing any strats. It took me 2 hours because I was slow at shooting the things because I didn't know where they were because again I didn't practice, but it's easy in the sense that there is just zero urgency. So now let's look at Vesper's Host. In the first encounter you have a minute to dunk the initial scanner or you will wipe. This means you have to be quick with killing all the adds to open the door so that you can access the terminal. This is a skill check. If you can't slay out fast enough, you wipe. Duality is a really good example of an unforgiving timer. You have Nightmare collapsing, and if you don't reach that bell in time, you wipe. It's extremely unforgiving, and it is present in the first 2 encounters. Vault specifically, you have to be really quick at getting the standard and getting back, and you have to do this 6 times with very little room for error. It's not easy. And then on the final boss, again in the lead up to damage, you really have nowhere that you can just chill and hide to recover your health. You need a build that you can get your health back. And then when you get transported, if you kill the wrong Scion accidentally, you wipe. It's very unforgiving. Warlord's Ruin is a wonderful dungeon, and it does have some of these, but I find them pretty lenient. The first encounter, you have the cage where you have to shoot the Acolyte's eyes. It's not bad. It also forces you out of cover to capture the totems, so it's got a mechanic that makes you expose yourself. And the maze has a bunch of traps, and the traversal parts of that dungeon are one of the hardest ones to be sure, and I will touch on traversal soon. But then you have the ogre boss where, yeah, you can die to the freezing cold, but that is only if you aren't paying attention. I would say it's a pretty forgiving timer mechanic, but it is something that can wipe you. And then on the final boss, you do have the corrupted hex drinker that you have to punch, which again is an instant wipe mechanic if you mess it up, but it's also a mechanic that's pretty forgiving once you know what you're doing. So now let's look at Vesper's host. On final boss, you have to shoot the panels, and you have an instant wipe mechanic if you shoot the wrong one. This actually applies in every encounter, so yeah, that's pretty unforgiving as one lapse in judgment is an instant wipe. So you have to be sure of the panels that you're shooting. As for an unforgiving timer, there is a sector purge countdown after you shoot the panels in the lead up to damage. This is 44 seconds, so you have to dunk operator, grab scanner, and then scan 4 enemies by running right up to them while they're all shooting at you and you're trying not to die. And then you have to identify the right one and kill it in time so that you don't die by getting shot, and also so that you can get the core and dunk it safely before the timer expires. This timer isn't too bad, but it definitely can get a little tight sometimes if your build isn't set up properly to take out the puppet quickly, and if you get bad scanner luck. And luck definitely plays a part in a solo flawless, but also you make your own luck, and that comes in the form of having a proper build that can mitigate these roadblocks that Bungie has put in place. And there is another thing in the lead up to damage, and that is the radiation puppets. These guys can wipe you just by getting close to you for too long, and they can be very fast and very plentiful sometimes. But the biggest thing that they are is unpredictable, and that is something we don't have much of in Destiny, but that they have said that they will implement more of in the future. Right now, I can tell you pretty much every ad spawn and ad trigger in Destiny. From GMs to raids to dungeons, all the enemies spawn in the same locations after certain things trigger them. But in this dungeon, I can't really tell what makes these puppets appear. I've had 3 in that dunk room before for whatever reason, and other times you just have 1 or 0. And that randomness is a new mechanic that we have yet to really deal with, and that makes things tough. You have to react on the fly and deal with them or you'll die. And then, like I said, the boss fight itself also introduces randomness with the lightning strikes, where we haven't really seen that. You have to be able to read and react on the fly, where with a boss like Kel Echo, yes it moves, but the moves are scripted, so once you learn the boss fight, you know what platform it is going to move to and when it's going to do it. Keitel is one of the few bosses that has some randomness because she can go left, middle, or right, so it makes you react, which again can be another tough thing to deal with. But outside of those 2 bosses, we have very little randomness in Destiny, so it is just another mechanic that makes this a hard dungeon to solo flawless. Also, let's look at the servitor boss fight for a second. When you get TP'd, you have to deal with those exploder shanks, and sometimes they can be pretty damn random too and move up very quickly, or sometimes spawn in basically on top of you. The fight requires you to deal with them very quickly or you'll die. And even dunking the suppressor augment on the boss can be very dangerous. Lord knows it got me in a few of my attempts. And then we have the traversal sections. Overall, not too terrible. But you do have the lightning strikes to deal with, and if you jump at the wrong time, or more so land at the wrong time, it's game over. It is sort of like the boop wall in Shattered Throne. You have to be very careful how you approach it. There are also lots of trip mines to deal with, which can also be very dangerous. And even some enemy fights that you do need to be wary of, as they're pretty tanky and you'd hate to die there. But it is the combination of the unforgiving timers, the radiation puppets that can swarm you, the exploder shanks and mechanics pushing you out of cover when you want to hide and regen your health, the instant death mechanics from shooting a wrong panel, and then the very challenging boss fight filled with boss type enemies that you have to fight while trying to deal damage to the boss, all while avoiding the ground and lightning strikes everywhere, that makes this such a hard dungeon to solo flawless. It really is the accumulation of everything Bungie has learned over the last 8 dungeons. Aside from the fun little trap mechanics like Grasp of Avarice and Warlord's Ruin has, this dungeon has it all. And it's funny because I can't remember if it was in a TWID or a Vidoc or what, but I remember them saying they tuned this dungeon to be very challenging even for our current sandbox, and I was very skeptical. I've talked a lot about how power crept we've become, so I wasn't really sure what they could do to make a dungeon a challenge with our current power level. But they looked at every difficult element from those past dungeons and incorporated it into this one to make it the toughest dungeon to solo to date. And that is why Vesper's Host is the toughest dungeon to solo flawless in Destiny. Anyways, that's it for the video. Let me know down below what you think of my take on why this dungeon is such a tough solo, as I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Or maybe you think it's easy as hell. If so, let me know why. and leave a like and sub on the channel as it would really mean a lot. And lastly, thanks for watching to the end if you're still here. You're awesome. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.